something that's very common in the lives of families who are caring for someone with dementia. And because this is a little different of a panel discussion, we're going to ask that participants bring their questions forward relative to the subject matter we're talking to, and we'll be introducing those questions throughout our session today rather than at the end of the lecture. So I'd like to take this time to introduce you to our panel for today. We have Hella Brand joining us, who is a physician assistant at the Stead Family Memory Center here in Phoenix. And Hella will represent a lot of the medical issues that often arise in family conflicts. We have Jennifer Kupichevsky joining us today, and she is an attorney with Kyle and Kupichevsky in Phoenix, Arizona. Jennifer is an ASU grad and has a wonderful background serving both as an assistant attorney general and also working for the Maricopa County Public Fiduciary program, where she handled a variety of cases involving guardianship and conservatorship, which is very relevant to the discussion we'll have today, and has a long history of working with families. And finally, Laurie Nissen is a licensed clinical social worker, and she is the director of Family and Community Services here at Banner Alzheimer's Institute and the Banner Sun Health Research Institute. But leading this discussion today is Heather Mulder, who is the outreach manager here at Banner Alzheimer's Institute. So ladies, lead us into a dynamic discussion.
Great, thank you, Jan, and thank you to all of our attendees for joining us today. I think, as Jan had mentioned, this is going to be a very dynamic discussion. We've brought together a variety of different perspectives to be part of the conversation today. Before we jump in and start introducing topics, I found some statistics related to family contributions in providing care to someone with Alzheimer's disease. These were found in the 2016 Alzheimer's Association Facts and Figures publication. It stated in 2015, 15.9 million family and friends provided 18.1 billion hours of unpaid care to those with Alzheimer's and other dementias. That care had an estimated economic value of $221.3 billion. Approximately 2/3 of caregivers are women and 34% are age 65 or older. 41% of caregivers have a household income of $50,000 or less. On average, care contributors lose over $15,000 in annual income as a result of reducing or quitting work to meet the demands of caregiving. Alzheimer's takes a devastating toll on caregivers. Nearly 60% of Alzheimer's and dementia caregivers rate the emotional stress of caregiving as high or very high. About 40% suffer from depression. 1 in 5 care contributors cut back on their own doctor visits because of their care responsibilities. And among caregivers, 74% report that they are somewhat to very concerned about maintaining their own health since becoming a caregiver. And as the disease changes, it can really upset the balance within a family. Subsequently, old family issues, pre-existing tensions, and challenging family dynamics are likely to resurface. These tensions can escalate when decisions need to be made about the person with dementia, such as the living situation, driving, ongoing care, etc. Emotions run high with this added stress, particularly when family members each share a unique relationship to the affected person, are tired, stressed, and often understand the situation very differently. A lot of times we will say something to the effect of, if you know one person with Alzheimer's disease, you know one person with Alzheimer's disease. And that's the same for family situations as well. Each family is going to be unique in their dynamic prior to the diagnosis, and probably this is just going to complicate things for them a little bit more. Struggles in families can range from just minor tension or unease about decisions that are being made, all the way up to creating rifts within the family and unresolvable conflict. I found this quote from Jeff Foxworthy that I thought was apropos for this discussion, and he said, "I wish people could relate to the people that I'm related to." And I think that really speaks to, we have varied perceptions. Each of us is coming from a different angle. We had a different relationship with the person with dementia prior to the diagnosis, and as the disease progresses, that's going to continue to change. As we discussed the different tensions that can arise because of varied family dynamics, we kept coming back to kind of the same issue, and it was that family members are not on the same page. That can happen for a variety of reasons. Perhaps we live at a great distance from the person with dementia. Perhaps we can relate it back to the unique relationship that we shared with that person as well. But regardless, not being on the same page can cause a lot of tensions and a lot of issues that now family is going to need to deal with. So I wanted to start at the beginning of the process when we're not on the same page and start a discussion about the diagnosis and progression of the disease. And I think this can come, again, from a variety of different angles. Some people, when they're noticing symptoms, perhaps family members will say this has been completely blown out of proportion. This is a normal part of aging. We can see people in denial about the changes that they're seeing. Oftentimes we think of this as being someone removed from the primary caregiver, but this can also happen in reverse as well, where maybe a holiday has come around, family comes in to visit, and they say, oh my gosh, what has happened to mom? And it's the primary caregiver who is kind of in denial about the changes that they're seeing. So I would love to hear from some of our panelists about how you handle these sorts of situations or what you've seen in these types of situations related to diagnosis and progression.
Well, one thing that I often see is that the person with the dementia often has a lack of awareness or lack of insight into their own level of confusion. And this isn't because they're in denial, but because of changes in the brain that affect their memory, also affect their awareness and ability for insight. And so that can be a big problem, as extended family members are also having a hard time accepting, coping, or understanding that the person with dementia has dementia. That lack of awareness can kind of validate or promote that denial within the family system. And so sometimes people are unwilling to take a closer look because mom or dad is saying, I'm just fine.
And I don't think it's always a question of even denial. I think sometimes there's a sense of sort of normal family balance. Your mom, your dad, we're the parents, we take care of ourselves, the kids are growing up, they have their family, we don't want to be a bother, and so there's kind of a minimizing of symptoms. There might be an awareness of it, but a minimizing even of symptoms sometimes. So I just wanted to interject that. I think the other challenge is that adjusting to any difficult diagnosis, to any stress has stages, and people move in and out and can be at different points in the process, and that makes it a challenge then when we expect somebody to be at our same level. So I think that's one of the maybe points we want to talk about today. And lastly, I think it's the challenge of the disease. Even in early symptoms, they wax and wane. You know, we see them and well, maybe it was this, but it's easy to explain it off. And then it's only as time goes on and the symptoms are becoming more and more apparent. So depending on where somebody has observed along the way, I think it makes it difficult too.
That's interesting that you both, from a medical perspective, bring up denial. As an attorney, it's always surprising to me how the family will have known about the diagnosis often for years and will end up in my office on an emergency basis because they need a guardianship or they need access to certain accounts and the person is no longer able to participate at all. And I'm always surprised that they didn't take steps early on in the diagnosis, such as executing a healthcare power of attorney or a general durable financial power of attorney that would have enabled them to act on behalf of the person rather than being in an emergency situation and now we have to go to court to get that kind of authority. So definitely that denial increases cost and it increases the family stress potentially in the long run.
I think too, as Hella was saying, this is Laurie speaking, about the family roles. Jennifer's point is well taken, but often the children don't want to push mom or dad to put those documents in place when they say, no, we're not quite ready for that, because mom or dad has always been the matriarch or the patriarch, and we listen to them even though now their memory or their faculties seem to be eroding. So I think those role changes really play a part too in families not taking action early on when they can and should.
They're difficult to navigate. They're just emotionally charged, kind of landmines at times. Part of it, talking about putting advanced care directives in place, doing powers of attorney, that discussion really has to start early in the process when they're still in early stage. And we often end up seeing people for evaluation in the moderate stage. So we've all lost a chunk of time there. And the other is there's still that, that illusion that, things are going along and I'm not appreciating the subtlety of the changes day to day. And so I think things get put off.
That's such an excellent point about coming in at the moderate stage, because of course as the lawyer, you want to make sure that this person isn't being exploited or unduly influenced, and once they're further along in the progression of the disease, it gets much harder to execute those documents, or for the lawyer to feel comfortable executing those documents and for them to be valid. And so then that's why the lawyer says, well, you need to make sure that it's something that you really can still do.
One of the challenges that I see quite often is, if we're looking at unique family situations, is how do we navigate this when it's a question of blended families? So this is a second marriage and there are children on either side, and who's taking responsibility for what, or who should take responsibility when there are things like finances tied up with it, and protecting inheritances. I think those are other issues that I see come up fairly regularly. And then the other one that is equally difficult to realize, I think, for adult children or extended family, is the very real possibility that both parents are experiencing some degree of cognitive changes, because the risk is there as they get older. So we're seeing more and more where both of them are in different stages. And that makes it challenging because neither one of them can reason, and that's what we're trying to work with them to affect change.
So one of the participants is asking what to do when this is a wife whose husband has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and her kids just don't want to accept that, in fact, that's the diagnosis. So how would she deal with that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because we often encounter that here in our clinics and in the community, where the spouse has demonstrated some memory problems. Wife takes him in, gets an evaluation, we get a clear diagnosis. We try to bring the family in and say, hey, this is the diagnosis, I need support. And kids, often local, but more often than not out of town, talk to mom or dad on the phone. He sounds fine to them. They think maybe mom is overreacting. So that can be a very difficult problem. I think if you've gotten a clear diagnosis from a medical professional, when you follow up with them, if there's a way to involve the children even by speakerphone to kind of hear it from the mouth of the expert, that can be a useful intervention.
I agree that if need be, a family conference is helpful, and using the doctor and other people from the team to kind of participate in that, to kind of, sometimes people need to review how it is that you even got to a point of diagnosis. What does Alzheimer's really mean? What does it look like in the early stages? How does it change over time? How is it affecting their function? And sometimes it's pointing out the subtleties that helps children begin to understand more. You know, unfortunately, lots of times they live far away, so sometimes it is a phone conference. I think making use of the access that we have to the website, so having family turn to our information on the web where they can learn more about Alzheimer's disease, or our families as they come through are given a navigating memory loss book that explains diagnosis and stages and what to expect, with the intent of sharing it with families. So I think sometimes it's additional education, it's advocacy on the part of the parent, and then our trying to help negotiate to a point where maybe everybody can be on the same page.
So another participant has just written in with another unique question regarding mom is in a memory care unit, so we know she probably is in the moderate stage, pretty confused, and her brother has recently died, and the question is, do you tell mom? So you can see where it brings in some additional, and you can see where families might be divided. We shouldn't tell her. Others say, no, this is her sibling. This is important. How might you comment to that?
I think these are very delicate situations that you raise, and a very good question to ask. And I think you really have to, it's really pretty individualized. But what I often say is to let people know what's happening when they're surrounded by family. So you might visit this person at the memory care center and gently let them know, and then kind of see where things go. It may be that she won't remember and never asks about it again, or it may be that she grieves and you offer her some support in her grief. And then we just kind of leave that alone. We don't want to keep bringing up this topic. We don't want to create a situation where she's continually grieving, because that's not going to be healthy for her. In other cases where people maybe have, dementia, they also have really significant depression or behavioral disturbances. It may be that the family decides that what she doesn't know is okay, because if her daily life is going to be calmer and of better quality, that we may decide or opt out of that.
So here's another interesting question about diagnosis and progression, really. Someone writes that her husband has severe cognitive impairment, but interestingly enough, when visitors come by, he seems to rally, and therefore the visitors say, well, he's fine. And so subsequently, I suspect she's not getting the kind of support that she really needs to validate her needs. How might you respond to that?
I would say that's fairly typical. We see that even in the course of a visit. The person will be more verbal, will rise to the challenge. They put on a social face. And I think if we think about it, that's kind of true of life in general. We interact in the outer world a certain way, and then we interact in our inner world at home in the comfort of people we know and love. We kind of let it all hang out. So it's not unusual to see one thing at home and then the person rise. The other is, I think in part there's a stimulation that comes from being around people, and that's why we encourage socialization. At home, it's easy to fall into a routine, to not be interacting as much. You've had years of conversation and everything's been said, or you're busy trying to do your chores. So I think that's also got to be considered. And lastly, I would just say that sometimes it's a quiet conversation on the side before that, and just have people watch for, again, those subtleties. Yeah, he's social, but can you really stick with the topic at any depth beyond superficial? Are you noticing that he's having trouble coming up with words? Are you noticing that he kind of repeats himself within about half an hour? Sometimes they can hold it together for 15 minutes, but test them for 30 and they'll see it. Laurie,
yeah, I was just going to add into that. I think that sometimes we have to shift our thinking. We think, oh boy, he's putting it on, and so our friends don't really get how bad off he is. But on the other hand, maybe we should just celebrate the moment. Maybe when he rises to the occasion, we should feel good and bright about that. But on the flip side, you still need to make sure that you're getting the support you need. So whether it's from the friends that are visiting and know your husband well, and if they can't accept those changes or have a hard time identifying them, that's where a support group or seeking some outside counseling could be really helpful, because this is a story we hear time and time again in the support group where people are really needing to gather support from other caregivers who are experiencing something similar and can offer support and some strategies to overcome some of these hurdles.
Oh, sorry, Heather, go ahead.
I think this is a really great discussion surrounding diagnosis and progression, but I want to keep us moving through the topics. I think you'll see this one is somewhat similar, has some similar issues that go along with medical decisions, but I do want to mention briefly, Hella talked about the resources that we have available online. You can access those by going to banneralz.org and click on online education. We have many of our core classes that we have taped and posted on the website, so if you have family members that live at a distance, they can easily access them. The same for all of our catalog of dementia dialogues are housed on our website as well, so you can have family members and friends access maybe a specific topic that you'd like them to learn more about. When it comes to medical decisions, there's kind of a few different angles, again, that we can go from this. I think we will see conflict probably when it comes to decisions about treatment. Do we manage other chronic conditions? Are we looking at treatment versus comfort care? And then finally, we bring in, of course, the legal aspect into this as well when we talk about advanced directives and those medical powers of attorney, or do we, as Jennifer mentioned, ultimately end up going to court over some of these discussions? So I'm curious what all of you have seen in relation to this.
Jennifer, do you want to speak to the directives and why they're so critical?
Sure. Well, people often think, if someone's in an accident that they can make decisions, and that's true in some emergency situations. The hospitals can look to the surrogacy statutes, but for ongoing management of something like dementia, the person, when they had capacity, really needs to have delegated that healthcare decision-making to someone else. And if they didn't want certain life-saving treatments potentially, or they only wanted comfort care, then they need to have filled out the living will to indicate to their healthcare agent what those directives are and what their wishes are. So I know that the Arizona Attorney General has on their website a life care planning packet in which they have the healthcare powers of attorney where you can nominate your agent, and they also have the living will, and those are clearly valid in the state of Arizona. They're free. You can download them. They can be registered with the Secretary of State, and so they can be made accessible to a hospital if they're given a password. So those are really important, because if you don't have those, then you come see my partner, or an estate planning attorney, and they do the estate plans. But if you don't have those, then you're going to end up with an attorney who's going to have to file for guardianship, and that's a court process. It essentially gives someone healthcare decision making along with all of the other person's basic decision making, and requires a finding of incapacity, and that's certainly a much more expensive process, is why I brought up planning early on and getting those directives in place when the person still has the capacity to do so, so that you don't end up in court and in crisis, because that's really hard for families.
And just to add to what you're saying, Jennifer, this is Laurie. One of the things I see a lot is that in Arizona, specifically, we have a medical power of attorney, but we also include in the life care planning packet the mental health care power of attorney. And I always try to let people know that you think of that along with the durable power of attorney as kind of a comprehensive power of attorney. And so people say to me, well, I don't need that mental health power of attorney because I've never had any mental health problems. Well, we know with dementia, if you were to develop dementia, this is a brain disease, and so there is going to likely be a lot of mental health issues that accompany that, whether it's depression or psychosis or behavioral disturbance. So I think for people to make sure that they complete their advanced directives thoroughly is really important as well, because if they don't, and the person has dementia and they have some kind of behavioral disturbance and needs some stabilization in a behavioral health program, and they've left out that mental health power of attorney, then even though they've done their advanced directives, that missing piece may mean that they have to actually go to court anyway to get guardianship with mental health powers.
Right. That's such a, I'm so glad you brought that up, because we do think of it that way. That document is also available at the Attorney General's website to be filled out, and that really enables the person, if they're in need of admission for some kind of related psychiatric issue or behavioral issue, if they don't have that document, then yes, they would need what we call inpatient mental health authority to be granted by the court. And again, that's often done because it's a crisis. It's some kind of crisis that the person has had. That's often done on an emergency basis, which is an expensive court process. And it used to be, up until last year, that the person, could simply say, and I want to revoke my powers of attorney, and they are freely revocable. And when they went into the hospital, sometimes if they said that, then the hospital would require a guardianship anyway to cover themselves. Now there's a new statute that says, if a doctor certifies that the person is not really capable at the time of the admission of revoking that power of attorney, that it would stay in place until they had regained capacity. So the legislature has taken some steps to lessen the burden on families in having to go to court and making those powers of attorney stronger.
Good points. If I had to add to, what are the main issues that I see related to medical decisions, one is just what medications do we use? Why are they being prescribed? And am I comfortable giving them to my person? And I think you always have to weigh risks and benefits. What do you expect to gain? What do you expect to possibly be negative in terms of side effects? But remember that decisions are being made in the best interest of the person and not necessarily in accordance with your own values. We see that even at end of life, your person may clearly have indicated that they would not want heroic or aggressive measures, but you're not ready to let go and you're turning things around. We have adult children who are very into holistic lifestyles and juicing and doing all kinds of natural medications that aren't necessarily in line with something that mom or dad would be familiar with or comfortable with over the years. And then I think the other part that I would just say is that we tend to think of needing those powers of attorney in the case of a hospital and that, but the reality is that a person's capacity, their ability to understand complex information, break it down into what are the risks, the benefits, the pros or the cons, what are consequences to decisions I might make, becomes progressively more impaired. And that means that even routine health care fairly early on gets difficult because they can't, A, retain what they're being told, and B, they can't interpret it in terms of what it means for them. So you're acting fairly early on in their best stead. And as time goes on, any medical or health stressor has much more impact on a person with dementia. So we run the risk of delirium or psychosis. And that makes it challenging knowing, do we want to put them through a procedure? So that's what I would add in terms of comments.
So one of our participants on the webinar, Jennifer, asked this really of you. My husband's initial diagnosis, they were told to get legal direction, and they did complete the durable power of attorney and advanced directions. Her question is, does the durable power of attorney cover the mental health part that you talked about?
it will depend on how the document is drafted, but what the person's looking for, and let me back up, typically a durable health power of attorney, that refers to financial decision making, most often called a financial power of attorney, durable power of attorney, or general power of attorney. And the healthcare powers of attorney are usually labeled healthcare power of attorney or medical power of attorney, and then the mental health is typically separate. So the caller would want to look through the document and see if there's language in the document that allows the agent to admit the person to a psychiatric facility, sometimes called a level 1 behavioral health facility, or inpatient mental health treatment. So that kind of language to see if they do indeed have that authority.
Great, thank you.
So let's move the discussion on now. We talked about medical decisions that need to be made, but there's also many non-medical decisions. I think this will rope in the topic of finances. Oftentimes there's conflict surrounding how money should be spent, what it should be dedicated to. Sometimes we even get the dynamic of children wanting to preserve their inheritance. Non-medical decisions also go beyond finances. It goes to like a living situation. Are we going to move this person? Are we going to bring in outside care? Those sorts of things. So I guess I'll turn it over to Laurie and get your comments on non-medical decisions.
Yeah, I think sometimes this can be the most difficult decision in the process. Oftentimes a spouse, and I'll give the example of that blended family we were talking about earlier, where a wife is taking care of her husband who has dementia. They've been married for 20, 30 years or more, but maybe they have separate children. And she's been taking care of him at home, and maybe the children don't have a really good conception of how his disease is progressing and how much care she is providing, both emotionally and physically. And so when a provider or a social worker makes a recommendation, hey, you really need to get yourself some respite care, it'd be good for your spouse to go to an adult day program, or you really need to get some in-home caregivers in the house to lighten your load because you're looking pretty frail to me. It may be hard for the spouse to accept, but maybe she does, and what I often find happens is she relays this message to the various kids, his children, her children. And sometimes the family is very supportive and they say, yeah, go ahead with it, but more often I see cases where the children are saying, well, you just want to put dad away, or you really don't, he's not that bad, you really don't need to spend his money on that kind of care, and that's often where conflict really starts. I've seen cases where the wife in this situation who's taking care of her husband is getting so much resistance from the children that she doesn't implement care, and I've seen cases where she ends up hospitalized or dying because family members are at conflict and will not permit or allow her to get care, and that's where things really get complicated.
Do you want to speak as well in your experience to the other side of that? So where adult children really have to be more cognizant of what's going on because care is not being provided. So recommendations are made and consistently not followed through medications, programs, whatever.
So in those cases where, you know, people are resistant or not on the same page, you know, as a social worker myself, I usually try to recommend some kind of family meeting, because I see myself as the social worker as the advocate for the person with dementia. And sometimes I can, as a more objective, I hope, or a more neutral party, can try to get all parties on the same page. So I do that a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's that families come into the office and we have a discussion. If there are out-of-town children or stepchildren, I'll ask that they participate by phone and make it clear that these are my recommendations and recommendations of the medical provider, and really try to be pretty directive in making recommendations about the care that needs to happen.
So one of our participants writing in is a wife caring for her husband, and they live on Social Security only, which is not uncommon, and obviously she's really concerned about his long-term care needs at some point, and then kind of what about her? So Jennifer and Laurie, you probably have a lot of experience in advising caregivers like this woman. Where do you begin? What should she do?
Well,
and then you can jump in, Jennifer. I was just going to say, I start by kind of looking at what the care needs are and making recommendations. And then the step 2 is how are we going to pay for it? We actually have a class that we teach here at Banner Alzheimer's Institute called Planning Ahead, and it's also available on our website, as Heather mentioned. So we talk about the different levels of care that are available and how might you pay for those. And for somebody who has a very limited income, we want to help them explore things like, is the identified person with dementia, did he or she serve in the military during wartime? Might they qualify for veterans aid and attendant benefits? Or do they have some funds that they can spend for a little while they may qualify for Medicaid long-term care all-tax? And so we'll often work collaboratively with elder law attorneys like Jennifer and her colleague Emily Kyle to help families kind of plan for that type of care and apply for those kinds of benefits.
And that's what I was going to, this is Jennifer, that's what I was going to mention, is that there really is two steps, and one is on the medical side, figuring out what the person needs, and then the second, this is where an attorney can be helpful but may not be necessary, and that is on the financial and planning. The VA does have advocates who will help make those applications, and they don't charge. And those benefits are really helpful if the person is eligible. The caller, if they want to explore that, will need the discharge paper, commonly known as the DD 214. I think it's a distinct document that explains when the person served. And then in terms of the Arizona Long-Term Care is our current Medicaid program. Medicare doesn't cover long-term care, so if the person needs substantial in-home and ongoing health services or out-of-home placement, and they're on Social Security, in all likelihood from an income perspective, they're going to be eligible. Probably the most common fear that we see is that the well spouse, the person who doesn't need that level of care, is very, very afraid that they're going to lose their home, that the government's going to take all of their money or their car, very concerned about, is there going to be anything left for me? And without going into a lot of detail, the answer is that there are provisions in the Medicaid statutes that do protect the well spouse and make sure they don't lose their home, their car, and everything, so that there is still income to take care of that person.
And just to add to that, I wanted to say that, this is a good time to also look to other family members and friends to step in. I know that caregivers often have a hard time asking for help, but to kind of rally together with family, friends, neighbors to see what help they can offer, and also explore some of the nonprofit opportunities like the Alzheimer's Association that does have some dollars that they can offer to help support respite, along with other agencies like the Area Agency on Aging Helpline or Duet, who can have volunteers who can do friendly visiting and also provide support or dollars towards care.
So I also want to move this discussion along, and we did not touch on one major non-medical decision that I think all three of our panelists run into with their families that they're working with. I actually found in the Hartford study, it said 71% of caregivers thought their person with dementia was unsafe driving, but continued to allow them to drive for many months after that. I'm going to open the discussion to Hella, and I'm curious if you could maybe briefly touch on why driving is such an issue, or even early on in the disease, and then maybe how you've seen these conflicts surface.
Right, so there are two concerns related to driving. One, with the changes that are going on in the brain, you have somebody who is gradually slower in processing information. Driving is about quick interpretation. You have to be able to remember directions. You have to be able to recognize directions. So you can get lost with driving, and these are people who will make one wrong turn and then every subsequent turn based on misinformation. They can end up states away, they can end up in canals, they can end up going the wrong way down a highway. So getting lost is a big concern, and the other is the potential to cause harm to self or to others because they're misreading the situation. They're tailgating, they're waiting too long, they're pulling in front of cars.
Well, and to add to that, I mean, you think about driving for yourself. I mean, it's a rite of passage. It's our symbol of independence. So we always want to use respect in talking with the person with dementia or taking steps to avoid driving, but families find this is a really hard thing to do because it really infringes on that person's ability and their control. And sometimes there are secondary benefits. I've worked with couples where the man was the sole driver, the woman maybe they lived in Boston or New York, she's never driven before, or maybe she doesn't want him to give up driving because she's got macular degeneration, and if I go ahead and move forward on this even though I know it's unsafe, then what will happen to our level of independence or our level of ability to get to where we need to go? So I think these situations are very complex, but as Hella said, they can really lead to dangerous situations. You know, in our other institute at Banner Sun Health Research Institute, we're in the West Valley, we're in Sun City, and so a lot of people have moved there to golf. So even when they comply with the idea of giving up driving a vehicle, we still find people with dementia who think it's okay to drive a golf cart. And so it's a really difficult situation. You have folks who have driven their whole lives since they were on the farm at 13, and they say things like, well, I've never had a ticket ever before, so why should I give up my driver's license? Or I've never gotten in an accident. So we have to weigh those situations with the reality of the situation, which is we don't want to wait until the person has an accident or harms themselves or hurts somebody else.
I think if there haven't been mood or behavioral concerns up until this point, when driving comes up is when we're liable to see anger, resentment crop up because, as Laurie said, the person isn't aware that they're having problems. That's one of the cruelties of the disease, is that they don't see that they're having a problem with driving. And it's not about physically handling the car. It's all of the judgment and the navigation that's the concern. So it adds to the mix, and that's where we often say, let the doctor be the bad guy. So you tell the doctor that driving needs to stop, you've seen unsafe practices, the doctor passes on the bad news, and you play dumb. Oh my goodness, wow, I'm really surprised, and move on. Equally important, I think, is we do our person and injustice if we don't plan for driving cessation. In other words, we don't plan for what is life going to be like for this person after driving stops. If all of a sudden I'm trapped in the house, I'm going to be resentful, or I'm going to get bored, or I'm going to get depressed. So what are those wants and needs that typically would get a person out of the house, and how do we continue to meet those and benefit their quality of life?
From a legal, I definitely want to hear the legal perspective of this.
Yeah, so from a legal perspective, I'm obviously very concerned about the liability of the family who owns that vehicle, and the impact if there is a catastrophic accident on not only the person, their health, and whoever may be involved, but also on the person who wasn't driving, and the potential loss of assets if they allowed someone to drive and they shouldn't have been and they weren't properly insured. So in our office, we give away a lot of legal advice, but we also give away 2 pieces of advice that aren't so legal. And one is, if you aren't carrying the $250,000, $500,000 policy and the liability umbrella, it's very inexpensive, and we recommend that people get it in the event that the person's driving and they shouldn't be. And the other one is, we always ask about, if the people are safe and there are guns in the house. Those are the 2 things in our meetings with people related to when their family member has dementia, what do I do, that come up all the time.
But on the other hand, I think it's also important, and I tell families as a social worker that, I wonder about whether your insurance will cover things like that. If that person already has a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, they have some kind of accident, what kind of liability do they have, and how will an insurance company stand behind them?
Yeah, what does it do to your assets, and what does it do if your person ends up in jail?
Right, and those are huge concerns, Laurie. I agree with you. Those are not great answers, but it's another way to get someone to address the issue, which is because we don't sell insurance products. Most attorneys don't. It's a telling them you need to contact your insurance broker and have this conversation. Is it a time where you could increase your insurance? And if you can't because they have a diagnosis or they're further along, maybe hearing that will help them make the decision to have the person stop driving.
Exactly, because I think Hella's point is well taken, that the medical professional should be saying you shouldn't drive, and then if you have an insurance company saying we've already dropped you, that also makes it easier for the family to enforce.
And let's not forget that the family can be held liable if there have been specific advisements to stop driving. And even I can think of a couple of cases where there have been repeated driving tests that have been failed and the person is still driving. Is that correct?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's sort of a different area of law than elder law that I don't practice in, but certainly, lawsuits can be filed if someone isn't, very, very negligent or knows of something that could have caused a hazard. So it's certainly, it's the big elephant in the room, but it is definitely one of the most important things that has to be addressed for everyone, not just the person driving, the people on the road, but also, like you said, for the family's assets and liabilities.
And I have a participant who kind of is looking for solutions when the person doesn't want to give up driving, doesn't think they have to. What should a family member do? Because families can get at odds, as we know, about the driving issue. What are some practical steps they can take, minus they don't have a doctor who's willing to send in a note? What else can they do?
Well, anybody actually can fill out a driver condition report and send it in. I had a gentleman who had Parkinson's disease and had early memory loss, and somebody from his church, I believe, had filled out a driver condition report and turned it in, and the Department of Motor Vehicles actually sent him a letter, and he had to go in and take a driving test, and he failed. In other situations where the person just has no insight, the family or friends or medical professional, if they're involved, can recommend, well, if you think you're doing so well at driving, let's just go have a driving evaluation. There are certain locations where you could go and have a driving evaluation and then get a printout report about the person's driving condition and recommendation.
Which helps a lot of time, but it doesn't always help if the person is really angry. Sometimes it's about who else can have the discussion. So maybe the spouse isn't going to be heard, but maybe an adult child might be heard in terms of, it's time to stop driving. The other is to know that this is an expected course in the progression of dementia. So how do we start planning for it now rather than have the curtain fall overnight? So remember I said driving is a want or a need. So if I know there's a want, I know that, for instance, with my dad, his favorite thing in the world was to go to the grocery store, and he loved sweets. So if you get used to bringing his favorite sweets to them because they were, quote, on sale, you've saved a trip in the car, so he gradually gets used to it. You park your car in front of his and, oh, you know what, I'm in the way, Dad, I'll drive tonight. So that, again, he gradually gets used to the idea of not driving.
And in some situations, you have to get more severe about that. I've had family members who've had to let the person with dementia know that the car is no longer working, that it needs to be fixed. They take it to the shop, and every time the person in the moderate stage of dementia asks, they keep saying, I'm sorry, it's still in the shop. And they just complain about the shop manager. You're right, they're taking too long, they're irresponsible, but don't worry, I'll call and follow up on it. In the meantime, I'll take you anywhere you need to go. Where would you like to go?
All good strategies. So we have one more topic that I wanted to bring up for discussion today, and then I will open it up to our participants to question if they have any other topics that maybe they would like introduced to our panelists. So the final one that I wanted to bring forward is unresolved conflict. We talk through this entire conversation about people not being on the same page, and sometimes despite our very best efforts and intentions, we cannot get them on the same page. So I'm curious maybe how you've seen these unresolved conflicts manifest themselves in your practices, and then also what can we do about them?
I've seen extended court proceedings because parties can't agree. I've seen kind of dissolution of family relationships, estrangement. You know, this person fall off because they're not in line with whatever the other half is agreeing to. I've seen situations where court orders have been put out to keep family from seeing their loved one because it's too disruptive to them. So along that whole, you know, continuum, I think are some of the issues that come up with unresolved conflict. And ultimately, it has to be, you know, what's in the best need for the person with dementia, and who's really the primary, and who's providing the care, and how do we support them, and are they the appropriate person?
So we've got a real-life situation that one of our participants is presenting. This is a blended family where both parents are currently in a memory unit. They go on to write, our step-family refuses to move their father out of our parents' hometown, where our mother has no children to visit her, and his family has little contact with him. We really don't want to separate them, but when and how is it okay to separate them? So these are classic family unresolved issues. So Laurie,
that's a great point you bring up, and one that we see often in family systems. And I guess it goes back to who it really is the decision maker, who has the authority to make decisions for that person. So if it is in fact the daughter, for example, who lives in another state, and she really feels like her mom needs more care, if she's got the advanced directives, the medical, and the durable decision-making abilities, it's really up to her to decide. In cases where families can't decide, or there is a power of attorney in place but it's not being followed, then that's often where you know, things end up getting legal, where one person decides that they want to get guardianship of this person so that they can make decisions that they think are in the best interest of the person with dementia.
Yeah, I mean, that as an attorney, that's really those family conflicts. That is the majority of what the litigation that surrounds guardianship cases. Of course, guardianship is decision-making over the person, whereas conservatorship is decision-making over the money. So the majority have to do with, as both of you have pointed out, placement, separation, and kids who maybe didn't grow up together aren't on the same page. What I'm seeing more, and what we're recommending more, is that couples who have a blended family, they often have a vision for how they think the family's functioning and what they think their future looks like into incapacity and even at the end of their life, and they may not have shared that with their respective kids. So what we're seeing a lot of is, we talked about separation, is one side will say, well, we want to divorce the couple, and that may not have been, when they're going to separate, that may not have been their vision, the couple's vision. And so we're really encouraging the couple to communicate to their kids in writing, how do we envision as we age, as if one of us gets dementia, or if they've already been diagnosed, what does it look like? You know, when do we need to stop living together, and then how would visitation work, and or do we want to remain in our home, and if so, if we, do we have enough assets for that, or however that vision is going to look like, but to be communicated to the kids, because the kids may have a very different view of their marriage than the couple does.
Good point. Mm-hmm. The other thing I see that's related to, you know, the topic of unresolved conflict is where maybe one or both of the people in the dyad have memory loss, and one of the kids moves in with them to essentially be the caregiver, but this adult child often has maybe mental illness or a substance abuse problem. They've designated themselves as the caregiver, if you will, but they can't actually take care of the person with dementia because they are dealing with the chronicity of their own mental illness or substance abuse, but want to be the designated caregiver because they're not able to earn an income of their own. And so one person might have dementia and not be aware of that this person is not a suitable caregiver. It may be that the spouse there is well enough to know, but because this is one of their children, they're having a hard time setting boundaries or setting limits. And then the other kids who are kind of outside of the home are really struggling with how do we handle a situation like this, and what do we do to protect mom or dad from one of our siblings or step-siblings who is really unwell and unable to make good care decisions.
And I might add, this participant is saying they're really more concerned about the effect it's going to have on mom and stepdad rather than the legal part when they're separated. Kind of, they've spent so much time together, and feeling lost if that person gets moved. So again, these are really dynamic situations where oftentimes, especially in blended families, children see it in a different way, and one might see the emotional connection, less are concerned about that, creating maybe chaos.
Mm-hmm. So we have just a few minutes left in our dialogue this afternoon. Do we have any questions that have been coming in that we need to address?
So we have a participant that asked, what do you do if you just can't get your family to work with you despite your best efforts? And I think we've all seen that in this work, that some families just can't pull it together, and it's very difficult leaving the caregiver. So maybe some ideas on this psychological family and thoughts you might have when you can't rally your own family.
I think that's a really difficult situation. You try your best to get everybody on the same page. You've involved maybe the medical provider, maybe you've involved the social worker, and you've had these conversations. Maybe you've been keeping people up to date by email, and then it just comes to a point where, as the caregiver, you have to take the best care you can of the person with dementia, but you also have to make sure that you're preserving your own health and wellness needs. And so sometimes you just have to make decisions that are in both of your best interests, but you're going to have to find another family to support you. And so that may be people who are friends or neighbors who really kind of understand your situation. But oftentimes that's where people find support groups can be incredibly invaluable in providing support and strategies for overcoming these challenges, but also can become your friends outside the family and your support system that you will critically need through the progression of this disease.
I think the impact on a caregiver's health from continuing to fight a reality is significant. So you have to keep that in mind. If your own mood and stress is significantly impaired because of a reality that just isn't coming around, as difficult as it is, you have to let it go and move on to other arrangements.
Well, to our panel and to Heather, thank you for leading such a dynamic discussion today. Clearly there are many, many family conflicts that arise that are very normal, and we could go on for much longer. We want to thank you for joining in today. As a reminder to our participants, this is recorded, and it will be uploaded shortly to our website. So if you'd like to share this with other family or friends, please feel free to do so. An evaluation will be emailed to you, and we really thank you for taking time to provide us feedback. For those who love to listen to our webinars, we'd like to invite you to our March 15th webinar, where Mary Lou Hernandez is going to discuss another challenging topic when it's no longer working at home. How do you handle care transitions? So we hope to see many of you back on our March 15th webinar. Until then, thanks for joining Dementia Dialogues, where we bring this dementia education to you.